say they're sorry, but not in such a way. I think the problem with sorry comes with, I think there's a problem with sorry because I think sorry can often mean, I'm sorry, now let's get beyond that.
Yeah.
I think this is why I keep using the word recognition. It's more along the lines of, yes, I recognize that a horrible thing happened, and yes, I now want to work with you both in response to your pain and with you to make sure this does not happen again in this church. And I think that's been very important to many survivors, that they've been offered an opportunity. For those who want to return to the church, and I want to say something about that in a second, I think for those who want to be in the church, who want to return to the church, it's very important, I think, for them that they have been offered an opportunity to work with the church to prevent further abuse of any sort, but also to work with children who have been abused outside the context of the church, that the church work with survivors to make itself into a kind of healing place or a welcoming place for people who have been abused. That seems to be very important to survivors.
It's a very powerful image. And as people know, I have returned to the church, but have great sympathy for the people who can't, who just choose not to. Tell us a little bit about what you were mentioning just a moment ago about survivors who want to return to their faith.
Well, I wanted to just say, one of the things I want to say is that I've learned in this research to be very, very careful about ever saying ought or should in response to survivors. And I think in general there should be less of that talk directed to survivors, whether it comes from the church, whether it comes from family members, whether it comes from psychologists. I think it's not helpful to tell survivors, this is what you ought to do, or this will be helpful to you, because for some survivors, they don't want to go back to the church, and they want to hate the church, and it's not my business, or I don't think anybody else's business really, to tell them, well, you know, you're hurting yourself by hating the church. I, at least, feel I do not have the right or power or knowledge to say that.
Yeah.
So I'm very careful about this, and I've been careful with the project to make sure that no survivor, wherever they are on the spectrum of their relationships with the church, that no survivor thinks I'm implying any kind of, anything that they ought to be doing. So, but if they do want to go back to the church, I mean, it does seem to me, or again, going back is the wrong expression, and I want to clarify that. Many never left the church. As many survivors told me, it was not easy to simply walk away from the church as young adults. I mean, that itself would have caused, I mean, in many cases, these were people who did not want others to know what had happened to them yet. They were not prepared to speak it. They didn't have the language to speak it. And so they didn't just simply disappear from church. I mean, many of them kept on going to church. And I've been surprised, actually, by how many survivors lived lives, early adult lives, you know, into their 40s, of real dedication to the church. I mean, and for many, there was never a break. They just went about their business in the church until one day they realized that much of the pain in their lives, and the pain was considerable, had its origins in this experience, and they recognized that, and then they wanted to talk about it. And in that case, some of them walked away from the church.
Well, so, and you've met a lot of us. You definitely have a sense of the range of our responses. Do you have any words of hope for survivors? Because as you know, the struggle can be a long time. It can be, in some ways, it can be a lifetime.
Well, again, yes, I do have words of hope, and these are words of hope that I have learned from survivors, really. And what it seems to me is that the survivors who've worked on this who've worked, how to put this, many survivors that I've spoken to, the majority of the survivors I've spoken to, have struck me by the quality and the intensity of their religious lives, of their religious or spiritual lives. Many of the survivors I've spoken to are people who really are thoughtful and who are involved in a struggle with these questions. And I think the hopefulness that I have seen comes from the survivors who have encouraged other survivors to be patient with their questions. not view the questions as a problem, even or especially the hardest questions, having to do with God's role in this, or God's absence, or what God wants now, or how they should be. I mean, very difficult questions. What I've learned from survivors is that survivors, it's good to be patient with those questions, and to not let the questions, to be patient with one's own process of questioning. And then to some extent, and I hope this isn't taken as frightening, and again, it's not meant to be absolute, but it does mean that the questions never end. And this may be true, this may be a lesson that survivors actually have to teach all of us, are able to teach all of us, is that these questions, they change over the life course, they take on different valence, and so forth, but they don't seem to go away. And I have been deeply moved and impressed by the courage of survivors in struggling with these life questions.
It's very powerful, Bob. I'm so glad you're doing this project. I will offer people, if they want to be notified when your book is eventually published, they can let my website know, and I'll set up an email list that we can send a notice. Because I know that it's got to be really deep thinking and just take time to get it right. I personally have appreciated how with what reverence you approach all people's spirituality, whether they've been Catholic or whether they've chosen not to be. You're really dealing with a very powerful piece of a person when you deal with their faith and a wound to their faith. As a closing comment, is there anything you'd like to add, anything you want listeners to hear before we sign off for the day?
Well, for listeners who are not survivors of clerical sexual abuse, but who are Catholics, I would say that I would really encourage them to be open and attentive to the survivors in their midst. And I think many of the survivors I spoke to who are in the church often feel, and this isn't everywhere at all times, but they sometimes feel lonely in the church, and they think, because it's hard, you look at a survivor and you realize that there's been a failure, not on the survivor's part, but on the church's part and on the community's part. Because this is something else I've learned, is that survivors, they were often abandoned by family members, or they weren't listened to by family members, as well as by nuns and priests and so forth. So I think when other Catholics look at survivors, they are forced to recognize where their own community broke down around this person in failing to respond to this person's crisis and needs. And I would just encourage Catholics to be open to survivors, and open to what they have to say, and open to the message that they bring about how to be Catholic. Because I have had my own Catholicism strengthened by many of the survivors that I've spoken to. So I think that's what I would say.
As always, I get so much talking with you about this, and I can't thank you enough for giving us a little bit of insight into your work.
Well, thank you, Teresa, for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Well, thanks a lot, Bob. God bless, and we'll be in touch again.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.